The autumn sun cast a golden haze over Fort Collins, Colorado, painting the lily pond in hues of amber. Evelyn Carter sat on her weathered bench, its wooden slats grooved from decades of use. At 58, her silver hair was tucked into a neat bun, and her reading glasses perched low on her nose. In her hands lay a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, its pages yellowed, its spine cracked from decades of use. Her father, Samuel Carter, had gifted it to her on her 18th birthday, just months before his sudden heart attack. Inside the cover, his handwriting still lingered. For Evie. May you always fight for the quiet voices. She traced the words with her thumb, as she often did when life felt heavy. Today marked 10 years since Samuel's passing, and the weight of his absence clung to her like a shadow. The park buzzed with its usual rhythm, retirees feeding ducks, mothers pushing strollers, and the distant jingle of the ice cream cart. Evelyn inhaled deeply, savouring the scent of cinnamon from a nearby bakery. For a moment, it almost felt peaceful. Then came the screech of tyres. A patrol car skidded to a stop, inches from the curb, its lights flashing silently. 2 officers emerged, Officer Dean Baker, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl etched into his ruddy face, and his younger partner, Officer Liam Collins, whose boyish features contrasted sharply with his rigid posture. Their eyes locked onto Evelyn like predators sighting prey. "Ma'am, identification." "Now!" Baker demanded, his voice slicing through the calm like a knife. Evelyn looked up slowly, her father's pocket watch, a family heirloom, glinting on her wrist. The metal felt cold against her skin, a stark reminder of the man who'd once worn it. "Is there a problem, officers?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Reports of suspicious activity," Collins snapped, his hand resting on his holster as if preparing for battle. "You fit the description." Suspicious activity, the same phrase they'd used decades ago when her brother Marcus was arrested for loitering outside a hardware store. He'd been 16, waiting for a ride home after buying nails to fix their porch. The memory clawed at her, the way Marcus had trembled in his too thin jacket, the sneer on the arresting officer's face as he'd muttered, "Should have stayed in your neighborhood." "I'm reading a book," Evelyn replied, holding up To Kill a Mockingbird as if it were a shield. "Unless Harper Lee's on your watch list, I suggest you move along." Baker snatched the novel from her hands, flipping through the pages with mock curiosity. "Evelyn Carter," he read from her driver's license, his voice dripping with disdain. "You live here? Doesn't mean you belong here." The words struck her like a slap. Evelyn had spent her career defending marginalized communities in this very city, yet here she was, reduced to an outsider on a bench. A small crowd gathered, their whispers sharpening the air. An elderly couple shuffled away, avoiding eye contact as if her plight were contagious. A teenager filmed discreetly on her phone, her knuckles white around the device. "Enough games," Baker barked, his meaty hand closing around her wrist. The cold bite of metal followed as handcuffs clamped her skin. "Resisting arrest," Collins announced loudly, though she hadn't moved. Humiliation burned Evelyn's cheeks as they shoved her into the cruiser. Through the grimy window she glimpsed her book abandoned on the bench, its pages fluttering in the wind like a surrender flag. The scent of stale coffee and sweat filled the car, mingling with the metallic tang of fear. The police station reeked of bleach and desperation. Evelyn sat in a cramped holding cell, her blouse wrinkled, her father's watch scratched from the struggle. A fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows on the concrete walls. Across the hall, a young man in a torn jacket muttered to himself, his eyes hollow. "First time?" he asked hoarsely, his voice cracking like dry leaves. Evelyn hesitated. "Does it matter?" He chuckled bitterly, revealing a chipped front tooth. "Nah, they treat us all the same. You're just another number here." The words hung heavy. Evelyn thought of Marcus again, how he'd returned home after his arrest, quieter, angrier, as if the light inside him had been snuffed out. She'd promised herself then that she'd fight for him. Now, sitting in this cell, she wondered if she'd failed. Hours dragged by. When a desk sergeant finally processed her release, he slid a clipboard toward her without meeting her gaze. "Charges: obstruction and resisting arrest. Court dates next month." Evelyn signed with trembling hands, the pen digging into the paper like a dagger. Outside, her oldest friend Margaret, a retired schoolteacher with a no-nonsense demeanour, waited by her dented sedan.
"Evie," Margaret breathed, pulling her into a fierce hug. Her floral perfume, a relic of their college days, brought a fleeting comfort. What in God's name happened? Evelyn recounted the arrest, each word sharpening her anger. Margaret listened silently, her knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. "They targeted you because you were alone, because you're black? A woman? Take your pick," Evelyn snapped, the dam of composure finally breaking. Tears blurred her vision as she stared at the scratches on her watch. "But I won't let this slide, Margie. Not again." That night, Evelyn sat at her oak desk, surrounded by case files and her father's old legal journals. Moonlight spilled through the curtains as she drafted a lawsuit against Baker, Collins, and the Fort Collins PD. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the fury of a fire long suppressed. Weeks later, Evelyn stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting her judge's robe. The black fabric felt heavier than usual, as if woven with the ghosts of every unjust verdict she'd witnessed. On her nightstand lay a framed photo of Samuel in his army uniform, a reminder of the integrity he'd drilled into her. "Your Honor, they're ready," her clerk, Daniel, murmured through the door. The courtroom buzzed as Evelyn entered. Reporters crowded the back rows. Community activists held signs reading, "Accountability Now." At the defendant's table, Baker and Collins sat stiffly, their uniforms starched to perfection. But it was the plaintiff who caught Evelyn's breath. Harold Granger, a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran with a cane and a Purple Heart pinned to his lapel. Harold's lawsuit detailed how Baker and Collins had thrown him to the ground during a traffic stop, fracturing his hip. "All I did was ask why they pulled me over," he testified, his voice quivering like a frayed wire. "They said I fit a description, but we all know what that means." Evelyn's chest ached. She glanced at her father's watch, its steady tick a silent plea for courage. When Baker took the stand, his arrogance faltered under cross-examination. "It was a high-stress situation," he insisted, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. "Officer Baker," Evelyn interjected, her tone glacial, "does stress excuse violating protocol or a man's dignity?" The gallery erupted in whispers. Collins stared at his hands, his earlier bravado crumbling like ash. Evelyn's ruling was swift: suspension without pay, mandatory bias training, and a public apology to Harold. As her gavel struck, Baker's face flushed crimson. Collins muttered an expletive, earning a sharp glare from his lawyer. But the victory felt hollow. That evening, Evelyn wandered through the park, her bench now occupied by a young couple. She picked up a stray copy of To Kill a Mockingbird someone had left behind, its pages dog-eared at Atticus Finch's final speech. "Judge Carter?" Harold stood nearby, his granddaughter clutching his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "Feels like someone finally listened."
Evelyn's eyes welled. "We'll keep fighting, Mr. Granger, I promise." The case sparked a wildfire. Town halls overflowed with residents sharing stories of traffic stops gone wrong, of sons and daughters handcuffed for walking while black. Evelyn became both hero and villain, lauded by activists, vilified by police unions. One icy morning, a package arrived at her doorstep. Her original copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, its cover smeared with mud. A note inside read, "Know your place." Margaret urged her to hire security. "They're trying to scare you, Evie." But Evelyn tucked the book into her briefcase, a silent vow. At the next town hall, she stood before a sea of weary faces and shared Marcus's story, the arrest, the night he spent in jail, the way it hollowed him out. "My brother never trusted the law again," she said, her voice breaking. "But trust is earned, and it starts here." Months later, Evelyn presided over a landmark case involving systemic reform. Baker and Collins, now stripped of their badges, watched from the gallery as new policies were enacted: body cameras, community oversight boards, de-escalation training. After the hearing, Harold approached Evelyn, a faded photo in hand. It showed Samuel Carter standing beside Harold's father, both in uniform, both smiling. "Your dad saved mine in Korea," Harold said. "Guess we're keeping the tradition alive." Evelyn clasped his hand, Samuel's watch warming against her skin. Years later, Evelyn retired, her robe replaced by a sweater knit by Margaret. The park bench bore a small plaque. "In memory of Samuel Carter, a man who taught us to listen." One autumn afternoon, a young girl sat there engrossed in To Kill a Mockingbird. Evelyn paused, her heart swelling. "Atticus Finch is my hero," the girl declared. Evelyn smiled. "Mine too, sweetheart, mine too." As she walked away, the girl's mother whispered, "That's Judge Carter. She changed everything."